put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The man who made $65 billion disappear. For 17 years, the world's wealthiest families handed their fortunes to a man who never made a single legitimate trade. They trusted him with their retirement, their children's futures, their entire legacies. And every single month, like clockwork, he sent them statements showing their wealth growing. Steady, reliable, magical returns that defied every market crash, every recession, every law of financial gravity. But those statements were fiction. The trades never happened. The profits were phantoms. And when the scheme finally collapsed in December 2008, it revealed something far more terrifying than fraud. It exposed how desperately the wealthy wanted to believe in magic, and how one man weaponized their greed against them. This is the story of Bernard Lawrence Madoff, the financial monster who didn't hide in shadows. He sat on regulatory boards, donated to charities, and smiled from the covers of business magazines while orchestrating the largest Ponzi scheme in human history. And the most chilling part, he almost got away with it forever. The myth of Bernie Madoff began long before the crime. In 1960, a 22-year-old Madoff opened Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC, with $5,000 he'd saved from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems. Nothing about his origin story screamed danger. He was a kid from Queens, the son of European immigrants, hustling his way into the exclusive world of Wall Street through the only door available to outsiders, technology. While the blue blood firms on Wall Street traded stocks the old-fashioned way, Madoff pioneered electronic trading systems, helping create what would eventually become NASDAQ. He was an innovator, a modernizer, a man who seemed to represent the democratization of American finance. By the 1980s, his firm was one of the largest market makers on Wall Street, handling trades for some of the biggest brokerage houses in America. He served as chairman of NASDAQ. He advised the Securities and Exchange Commission on trading regulations. Bernie Madoff wasn't just trusted. He was Wall Street royalty, who'd earned his crown through decades of apparent legitimacy. But behind this gleaming reputation, in a separate office on a different floor of his Manhattan headquarters, Madoff was running something else entirely. Something that would consume everything he'd built and destroy thousands of lives in the process. The investment advisory side of Madoff's business was deliberately shrouded in exclusivity and mystery. You couldn't simply call Bernie Madoff and ask to invest. You had to be invited, recommended by someone already inside the circle. This artificial scarcity created desperate demand among the wealthy. Getting into a Madoff fund became a status symbol, a mark of elite access that money alone couldn't buy. Country club conversations revolved around who was in with Bernie and who was still on the outside looking in. Madoff cultivated this mystique masterfully, turning away potential investors to make those he accepted feel specially chosen. And what he promised them seemed almost too good to be true, because it was. Month after month, year after year, Madoff's funds generated returns between 10 and 12% annually, with almost no volatility. When the market crashed, Madoff's investors made money. When the market soared, Madoff's returns stayed steady. It was the financial equivalent of a perpetual motion machine, defying the fundamental laws of risk and reward that govern all legitimate investing. His strategy supposedly involved a complex options trading technique called a split strike conversion, buying stocks while simultaneously buying and selling options to hedge against losses. On paper, it sounded sophisticated enough to confuse most investors into acceptance. But anyone with deep options trading knowledge would immediately spot the impossibility. The volume of options contracts Madoff claimed to be trading simply didn't exist in the market. It was mathematically impossible for him to execute his stated strategy at the scale he claimed. But his investors never asked these questions, and the few financial experts who raised red flags were dismissed as jealous or ignorant. The mechanics of Madoff's Ponzi scheme were almost insultingly simple, a fact that would later haunt his victims and regulators alike. New investor money flowed into his accounts, and Madoff simply used those deposits to pay returns to existing investors who requested withdrawals. No actual trading occurred on the investment advisory side of his business. Instead, Madoff's team generated elaborate fake trading statements using custom software, creating fictional transaction histories that showed steady gains across meticulously fabricated stock and options positions. These statements were masterpieces of financial fiction, detailed, professional, completely convincing. When investors received them quarterly, they saw exactly what they wanted to see: wealth accumulating with mathematical precision, insulated from market chaos by Madoff's supposed genius. The scheme required constant feeding. New money coming in had to exceed money going out, or the entire structure would collapse. As long as most investors left their money untouched, content to watch their paper wealth grow, Madoff could maintain the illusion indefinitely. He became a wealth management black hole, pulling in money from feeder funds, Jewish charities, university endowments, pension funds, and individual investors across the globe. Conservative retirees invested their life savings. Sophisticated hedge funds allocated billions to his strategies. Even other financial professionals, people who should have known better, handed Madoff their money without proper due diligence because his reputation seemed bulletproof. The ultimate irony was that Madoff's legitimate market-making business was genuinely successful and profitable. He didn't need to run a Ponzi scheme to be wealthy. He chose to, for reasons that seemed to blend pathological narcissism, addiction to adulation, and an inability to admit failure or ordinariness. But cracks in Madoff's perfect facade had been visible for years to anyone who chose to look. In 1999, financial analyst Harry Markopoulos performed a routine analysis of Madoff's returns for his own firm and immediately recognized the impossibility of what he was seeing. Markopoulos spent 4 hours examining Madoff's performance data and concluded with mathematical certainty that the returns were fraudulent. Either Madoff was front-running customer orders, or he was running a Ponzi scheme. Front-running would be illegal, but at least possible. A Ponzi scheme at this scale would be unprecedented. Markopoulos couldn't let it go. Over the next 9 years, he submitted detailed complaints to the Securities and Exchange Commission 5 separate times, each more urgent and comprehensive than the last. He provided forensic analysis, mathematical proofs, red flag after red flag, demonstrating the impossibility of Madoff's stated strategy. He titled one submission, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." The evidence was overwhelming, presented by a credible financial expert, with nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking out. The SEC did nothing. They conducted superficial investigations that Madoff easily deflected with his charm, his connections, and his reputation. SEC examiners were intimidated by his status, outmatched by his explanations, and seemingly incapable of comprehending that a former NASDAQ chairman and industry pillar could be running a fraud of this magnitude. Regulatory capture had done its work. Madoff had spent decades cultivating relationships with the very people supposed to oversee him, making himself indispensable to the industry's infrastructure. He was too big, too connected, too respected to investigate properly. And so the scheme continued, swelling to obscene proportions while regulators looked the other way. And Markopoulos watched in horror as more victims walked through Madoff's doors. Then came the revelation that transforms this story from financial crime into family tragedy. In December 2008, as the global financial crisis created a tsunami of withdrawal requests, that Madoff could no longer satisfy. He made a decision that would shatter his family forever. On December 10th, Bernie Madoff called his sons Mark and Andrew into his apartment and confessed everything. The entire investment advisory business was a lie, he told them. It had always been a lie. There were no investments, no trades, no sophisticated strategies, just an elaborate fraud that was now collapsing around them. His sons, who worked in the legitimate market-making side of the firm and had apparently known nothing about their father's crimes, were devastated. Mark Madoff immediately contacted a lawyer. The lawyer contacted the FBI, and the following morning, federal agents arrived at Madoff's penthouse to place him under arrest. When they asked if there was an innocent explanation, Madoff replied with chilling honesty, "There is no innocent explanation." But the horror for the Madoff family was only beginning. Mark Madoff, consumed by shame and facing potential legal exposure, despite his apparent innocence, hanged himself exactly 2 years later on the anniversary of his father's arrest. Andrew Madoff died of cancer in 2014, with family members openly wondering if stress from the scandal accelerated his illness. Bernie's wife, Ruth, once the queen of New York society, became a pariah overnight, stripped of her fortune and her identity. His brother Peter, who ran the legitimate side of the business, received a 10-year prison sentence. The Madoff name went from representing prestige to representing the ultimate betrayal, not just of clients and investors, but of family itself. Bernie Madoff didn't just destroy thousands of strangers' lives, he detonated his own bloodline from the inside out. The scope of devastation Madoff left behind defies comprehension. When trustee Irving Picard began unwinding the fraud, he calculated that Madoff's customers believed they had $64.8 billion in their accounts. In reality, only about $18 billion of actual money had ever been deposited with Madoff over the decades. The difference between those numbers represents fictional gains that never existed, paper wealth that thousands of people believed was real and made life decisions based on. Elderly retirees discovered their entire life savings had vanished, that the statements they'd been receiving quarterly for decades were elaborate fiction. Some victims lost homes, others lost businesses they'd used Madoff accounts as collateral for. Several committed suicide when they realized the magnitude of their losses and the impossibility of recovery at their age. Charities that had entrusted Madoff with their endowments collapsed overnight, unable to meet their obligations to the vulnerable populations they served. The Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, created by the Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate, lost virtually everything. $15.2 million that was supposed to fund education and human rights work for generations. Wiesel, who considered Madoff a friend, called him a thief, scoundrel, criminal, and said the betrayal cut deeper than the financial loss. Wealthy investors weren't the only victims. Madoff had specifically targeted Jewish communities and organizations, exploiting religious and cultural bonds of trust to gain access to concentrated pools of capital. He attended the same synagogues, sat on the same charity boards, cultivated the same social circles as his victims, using ethnic solidarity as a weapon to disarm suspicion. The psychological damage was incalculable. Victims blamed themselves for being greedy, for not asking questions, for trusting too completely. But the truth is darker. Madoff was a master manipulator who had spent decades perfecting the art of exploitation, and he knew exactly which vulnerabilities to target. Madoff's fall revealed uncomfortable truths about the entire financial system's complicity in his crime. J.P. Morgan Chase, which served as Madoff's primary banker, had internally flagged his account activity as potentially fraudulent, but continued doing business with him, and failed to file required suspicious activity reports with regulators. The bank eventually paid $2.6 billion to settle claims that it enabled the fraud. Feeder funds that channeled billions to Madoff without performing proper due diligence faced their own reckonings, with investors suing for negligence and willful blindness. These intermediaries collected substantial fees for giving their wealthy clients access to Madoff's exclusive funds. But many appeared to do almost no investigation of whether the returns they were selling were legitimate. The due diligence consisted largely of golf games, country club conversations, and the circular logic that if other smart people were invested with Madoff, he must be legitimate. Some investors who withdrew money before the collapse, taking out more than they'd originally deposited, found themselves targets of clawback lawsuits, with trustee Picard arguing they'd been paid with other victims' money and had to return it. This created a secondary layer of tragedy, with early withdrawers who thought they'd escaped unscathed, discovering years later that they owed millions to the bankruptcy estate. The entire structure of Madoff's operation revealed how Wall Street's culture of exclusivity, combined with weak regulation and willful ignorance, created the perfect environment for fraud to flourish at unprecedented scale. Everyone wanted to believe in the magic, and that collective delusion became a form of protection for Madoff. Questioning him meant questioning your own judgment for investing, so silence became self-preservation. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came from Madoff himself in prison interviews. Speaking with surprising candor to investigators and journalists, Madoff revealed that the fraud hadn't started as a grand criminal scheme. It began almost accidentally during a market downturn in the early 1990s, when he faced losses and couldn't admit failure to his prestigious clients. Rather than confess to poor performance, he made up positive returns, planning to make the money back later and correct the fiction. But markets didn't cooperate, and the lie required more lies to sustain it. One bad quarter became a bad year, then years, then decades of compounding deception. By the time Madoff realized the impossibility of his situation, he was too deep, too committed, too terrified of the consequences to stop. He described living in constant fear of discovery, unable to sleep, chain-smoking, consuming pills to manage anxiety, yet every morning putting on his suit and playing the role of the confident financial genius. The adulation became addictive even as it suffocated him. He was trapped in a prison of his own reputation, unable to escape the monster he'd created without destroying everything. Some psychologists who studied Madoff suggested he felt relief when the fraud finally collapsed, that arrest freed him from the exhausting performance of maintaining the lie. But that relief came at the cost of his son's futures, his wife's dignity, his victim's security, and his own legacy. The man who could have been remembered as a Wall Street innovator and technology pioneer instead became synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of trust. And the most chilling aspect? Madoff maintained that the sophisticated investors and feeder funds knew or should have known something was wrong. They chose not to ask questions because the returns were too good to risk losing access. In his telling, he wasn't a lone monster, but the willing instrument of Wall Street's collective greed and willful blindness. A dark mirror, reflecting the financial industry's most corrupt impulses back at itself. The courtroom scene when Madoff faced sentencing in June 2009 felt less like justice than exorcism. Victims packed the gallery, some weeping, others stone-faced with rage, waiting to confront the man who'd destroyed their lives. Madoff offered an apology that felt simultaneously genuine and inadequate. "I am responsible for a great deal of suffering and pain. I understand that. I live in a torment, but words couldn't resurrect stolen decades or restore shattered trust." Judge Denny Chin, calling the fraud extraordinarily evil, sentenced Madoff to the maximum 150 years in federal prison, a symbolic punishment for a then 71-year-old man that ensured he would die behind bars. The sentence wasn't about rehabilitation or deterrence, but about society's need to punish the unpunishable, to exact some form of cosmic justice, even when material justice was impossible. How do you adequately punish someone who destroyed the life savings of Holocaust survivors, cancer patients, charities, and families across generations? How do you sentence a man whose crime was so vast that most victims would never recover what they'd lost? The 150-year sentence was an admission of the justice system's inadequacy, a recognition that no punishment could ever match the crime's magnitude. Madoff was sent to medium-security federal correctional institution Butner in North Carolina, where he would spend the remainder of his life among other white-collar criminals and disgraced executives. Prison interviews in subsequent years revealed a man oscillating between self-pity and genuine remorse, sometimes claiming his victims should have known better, other times expressing horror at what he'd done. He developed no meaningful friendships behind bars, received few visitors after his family members died or cut contact, and gradually faded from public consciousness as new financial scandals captured headlines. On April 14, 2021, Bernie Madoff died in prison at age 82 from chronic kidney disease, his death barely making national news. The man who had once dominated Wall Street and Manhattan society expired alone in a prison medical facility, his name forever synonymous with fraud, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. Yet Madoff's real legacy isn't his death or even his crimes. It's the uncomfortable questions his fraud forces us to confront about wealth, trust, and human nature. His scheme succeeded for 17 years, not because he was a criminal genius, but because he understood the psychology of greed and status better than almost anyone. He knew that wealthy people wanted exclusive access to investment opportunities, that they would brag about their Madoff accounts to friends, while paradoxically wanting to keep it secret from outsiders. He weaponized the human tendency toward confirmation bias, giving investors the returns they expected to see, and knowing they wouldn't question what they wanted to believe. Madoff exploited the fundamental bargain of modern capitalism, the exchange of trust for promised future returns, and revealed how fragile that trust actually is when confronted with sophisticated deception. His victims weren't stupid or uniquely gullible. They were normal people making rational decisions based on available information and social proof from trusted peers. The real lesson of Madoff isn't about individual moral failure, but about systemic vulnerability. Financial markets run on trust, and when that trust is weaponized by someone with decades of cultivated credibility, the damage cascades through entire communities and generations. The regulatory reforms implemented after Madoff's arrest, increased scrutiny of investment advisors, mandatory custody of client assets by independent custodians, improved SEC examination procedures, address some surface vulnerabilities, but they can't eliminate the fundamental tension between the human desire for exceptional returns and the mathematical reality that consistent outperformance is extraordinarily rare and usually illusory. As long as people want to believe in financial magic, there will be magicians willing to perform the trick. The Madoff story forces us to reckon with uncomfortable aspects of wealth accumulation itself. Many of his victims were already wealthy, already comfortable, but wanted more, wanted the status of superior returns, wanted to beat less sophisticated investors, wanted the validation that came from being chosen by Bernie Madoff. This wasn't need-based investing, but ego-based investing, and Madoff intuitively understood that ego was a more reliable hook than greed alone. The fraud also revealed the darker side of exclusive social networks and trust-based business cultures, the same tight-knit communities that provide mutual support and opportunity also create echo chambers where critical questions feel like betrayal, where skepticism becomes social suicide. Madoff infiltrated these networks like a virus, using social bonds as transmission vectors for financial contagion. Victims often brought in friends and family, proudly sharing access to their guy, Bernie, unknowingly dooming people they loved to financial ruin. The guilt many victims felt wasn't just about their own losses, but about the losses they'd caused others through referrals and recommendations. This secondary trauma, the knowledge that your trust and advocacy destroyed others, created wounds that money could never heal, even if full restitution were possible. In this sense, Madoff's fraud was a corruption of human connection itself, transforming relationships into vectors of harm and turning social capital into a weapon. Today, trustee Irving Picard's recovery efforts have returned over $14 billion to Madoff victims, an unprecedented achievement in fraud recovery, but still far short of the fictional wealth that vanished. Some victims have received substantial percentages of their original deposits back, while others who withdrew money before the collapse have been forced to return it, creating a complex web of winners and losers within the victim population itself. The bankruptcy process has generated its own controversies, with debates over which claims deserve priority and whether to recognize fictional gains as legitimate losses. These disputes have kept the wounds fresh for over 15 years, preventing many victims from achieving psychological closure, even when they've received partial financial recovery. Meanwhile, Madoff's story has been adapted into books, documentaries, and films, each attempting to explain how the fraud happened and why so many smart people fell for it. But perhaps the most important question remains stubbornly unanswered. How many other Madoffs are operating right now, in other corners of finance, running smaller schemes that haven't yet collapsed? The structural factors that enabled Madoff, regulatory capture, social proof, willful blindness, the cult of exclusivity, haven't disappeared. They've simply adapted to new contexts, new technologies, new markets where trust can be exploited and compound returns can be fabricated. Cryptocurrency promised to eliminate the need for trusted intermediaries, yet the collapse of FTX in 2022 revealed that digital assets could host Madoff-scale frauds with even less oversight and faster timelines. The names change, the technologies evolve, but the fundamental dynamic remains. People want to believe in magic, and monsters are always ready to provide it for a price. Bernie Madoff died without revealing the full truth of his fraud's origins, or whether others had knowingly assisted him. He took secrets to the grave, leaving investigators and victims to forever wonder about the complete scope of the conspiracy. Did he act entirely alone for 17 years, manually generating thousands of fake statements? Did family members, employees, or business partners know more than they admitted? The answers died with him, preserved in whatever corner of hell awaits financial murderers. Because that's what Madoff was, a murderer, even if his weapons were spreadsheets and trust rather than guns and knives. He killed his sons, one by suicide and one by stress-induced cancer. He killed his victims' dreams, their security, their faith in human decency. He killed the reputation of an entire industry and an entire ethnic community that he weaponized for criminal gain. The death toll from his fraud can't be precisely calculated because it radiates through families and communities in ways that resist quantification. How many marriages ended over Madoff losses? How many college educations never happened? How many businesses collapsed when Madoff accounts they'd used as collateral vanished? How many suicides beyond the publicized cases were directly caused by financial devastation and shame? These questions haunt the survivors, the investigators, the regulators who missed every warning sign. The final, darkest irony of Bernie Madoff's life is that he didn't need to commit fraud to be successful. His legitimate market-making business was genuinely innovative and profitable. He had the skills, the knowledge, the connections to build real wealth through legitimate means. But somewhere along the way, perhaps in that early 1990s moment, when he first faked returns rather than admit underperformance, he discovered that stealing was easier than earning, that maintaining a lie required less skill than delivering genuine results. He chose the path of least resistance, the path of maximum ego gratification, the path that let him be worshipped as a genius without doing genius-level work. And once he started down that path, every day of continued fraud made turning back more impossible, until he was trapped in a maze of his own construction, with no exit except catastrophic collapse. This is perhaps the most valuable lesson from Madoff's story. The first compromise is the most important one. The moment you choose deception over truth, ease over integrity, adulation over authenticity, you begin building your own prison. The bars might be made of reputation and social pressure rather than steel, but they're just as inescapable. And when that prison finally collapses, it buries everyone nearby in the rubble. Family, friends, clients, everyone who made the mistake of trusting you. In the end, Bernard Lawrence Madoff represents something more terrifying than a criminal mastermind. He represents the banality of financial evil. He wasn't a brilliant schemer who constructed an undetectable fraud through technical genius. He was a moderately talented man who discovered that people wanted to be deceived and simply gave them what they wanted to see. The fraud succeeded because it confirmed biases, flattered egos, and aligned with what wealthy people desperately wanted to believe about their own sophistication and special access. Madoff didn't break into Fort Knox. He was invited in and given the keys because everyone assumed someone else had done the background check. His greatest con wasn't the fake statements or fictional trades. It was convincing the world that he was too successful, too established, too respected to be a criminal. He understood that the best disguise for a monster isn't a mask. It's a reputation so pristine that suspicion feels like blasphemy. And for 17 years, that disguise worked perfectly, allowing him to destroy lives, while society applauded his genius and begged for access to his funds. The real horror of the Madoff story isn't that one man was capable of such sustained deception. It's that thousands of intelligent, educated people chose to be deceived because the alternative meant admitting they weren't as special as they thought. The man who promised to protect his clients' wealth became the greatest wealth destroyer in Wall Street history. The man who claimed to deliver consistent returns delivered only consistent betrayal. The man who built a reputation on trust built an empire on lies. Bernie Madoff didn't just run a Ponzi scheme. He revealed the Ponzi scheme at the heart of financial capitalism itself, where paper wealth replaces real value, where perception becomes reality, and where the greatest sin isn't stealing, but admitting you don't have the answers. His crime was a mirror held up to Wall Street's soul, and the reflection was so ugly that the industry had to destroy the mirror rather than confront the image. But that image persists in the memories of thousands of victims who learned the hardest possible lesson. In the dark side of business, the most dangerous predators don't hide in shadows. They smile from the covers of magazines, sit on regulatory boards, and offer you exclusive access to opportunities that are too good to be true. Because they are. And by the time you realize it, you're just another name on a very long list of people who believed that this time, the laws of financial gravity didn't apply. Bernie Madoff's real legacy isn't the $65 billion he stole. It's the permanent stain he left on the concept of trust itself. And that, unlike the money, can never be fully recovered. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.